What public knowledge can tell us is how people define issues. What it can tell us is what kinds of choices and trade-offs they're willing to make. What it can tell us is the kind of language that they use. What it can tell us are the conditions under which people are willing to think about change and to be part of that change process. What it can tell us is people's fears about moving forward. It's when people start to express their views and people start to articulate things that maybe they'd never been asked before or had never put together before in a sentence or a paragraph or in an hour of a conversation. But public knowledge also comes by me sitting silently in a room and listening to you talk and realizing only in my silence something about myself, something I didn't know before, something I hadn't realized before, or something I was afraid of before, something I was unwilling to say before that was unsayable or unspeakable. And so this public knowledge that we can gain from only authentic engagement is pivotal if we want to really understand our communities, if we want to understand how change can come about, if we want to understand who is willing to be part of change, if we want to understand how fast change can be brought about in a community. We need to listen and engage people so that we can generate this public knowledge. People often ask me, why don't we just do polls instead of take the time to engage people authentically? And my response is this: how many times have you been called on the phone at night when you're making dinner or serving dinner, and someone starts to ask you questions and you wonder, where in God's name did they get these questions from? And then they start to ask you what your response is, and they give you A, B, C, and D, and you say, well, none of those responses actually reflect what I'm concerned about on this issue. We can do all the polls we want in the world. We can do more online polls. We can do more sort of call-in polls on local news programs at 6 at night, but they're not going to tell us about public knowledge. They're not going to give us the depth of understanding we need. They're not going to give us the texture we need. They're not going to give us the complexity of understanding that we need. In fact, what polls often do is create more gridlock. They divide people into camps before people have had a chance to talk about an issue. They stereotype us too often. What we need to do is to break out of that and to create more room in society for people to have real conversations where their real views, their real concerns are put on the table, and where just maybe those of us who believe that we don't share something in common may recognize that we actually do share something in common. I think when we're thinking about public knowledge, there are two things we need to think about. One is, what are we listening for? And here I think we need to be listening for how people define issues, which usually comes in sort of webs of concerns. It's not a simple definition for most people. We're listening for the values that people talk about. We're listening for how they talk about choices and trade-offs. Importantly, we're listening for where are they ambivalent, where are they torn, not apathetic or indifferent, but really where are they torn in thinking about different kinds of issues and concerns. We're also listening for the language they use, the words they use, the phrases they use, not so that we can spit them back in kind of a public relations way, but because those words and phrases hold meaning for people. They reflect the way people construct their lives and the way they lead their lives and how they create meaning in their lives. The second thing we need to do is we need to look for patterns, and this is very hard for most of us. You know, most of us have taught, I was taught, basically to pick out the piece of data, the one thing that someone said, and to grab hold of it and to say, this is what we know. But in authentic engagement, what we're looking for are what are the patterns that people used over time? How did they talk over time? How did they define things over time? You know, journalists, I work a lot with journalists, they often sort of listen to someone talk and they grab the anecdote and then they write the story around the anecdote. Makes for a sort of interesting story sometimes. In this case, we want to do the exact opposite. We want to first listen for patterns, and then we want to find the anecdotes or the phrases that best illuminate those patterns so that people can understand what it was that happened. It's a very different thought process. It requires enormous discipline to keep listening over time, and it requires taking notes in a different kind of way, and it requires talking about what people said in a fundamentally different way. But if you want to do authentic engagement, the notion of patterns, the notion of public knowledge, both of them are critical to creating any kind of traction and meaning in this work.